Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of IS-PEC Talks. Today, we're joined by Professor Hans Lund from the Department of Health and Functioning at the Western Norway University of Applied Sciences. Hans led a very successful cost action titled EVBRES, an international network aimed at promoting evidence-based research across Europe and beyond. Professor Lund's work focuses on methods, development, and a particular emphasis on evidence-based research, the idea that new research should systematically build on what is already known. This work speaks to something fundamental in implementation science. Before we even talk about scale up or sustainability, we need to ask whether we are producing the right evidence in the first place. Today, we'll be talking about evidence-based research as the starting point for implementation, why research waste persists, and what needs to change in how we design and evaluate studies. Thank you, Hans, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.
So before we start, just so everyone is on the same page, can you define evidence-based research? What does that mean?
In principle, it simply means that you, in a systematic and transparent way, are showing that you are fully aware of what has been done within the topic, or more specifically, the question you have formulated for your new study. So you know that there is a need to look at new dimensions or perspectives of the question, and you are not wasting your own time or resources or jeopardizing maybe some patient participations or just people participating in by being part of the control group. So they actually shouldn't have been there because we already knew that this was a good approach, or it doesn't work, so there's no need to even to consider this issue. That's the whole definition. But it's actually, if I should say a little bit more about the whole idea behind it, is an idea that is as old as science, when it was invented in the 500 years ago, was very clear. For example, there was a guy called Gilbert. He was writing a book published in 1600, and in the first chapter, he made an explanation of all the knowledge at the present time about magnetism. And based upon that, he stated, now you know that what I'm going to share with you in the rest of the book is new knowledge. It is my discoveries. So I can tell you that that's what we know, and that's not very much, but now everyone knows much more about magnetism thanks to me. And I mean, there's another history of the same kind, James Lund, dealing with scurvy from 1740 something. And he was doing exactly the same in the first chapter of his book. And I can give you a lot of references, and David Wootton, who wrote an amazing book about the invention of science, he had been using a number of pages talking about the cumulative aspect of science, meaning that the only thing that is, what is the English word that is legitimize our research activities is because we are standing on shoulders of those before
The
us.
giants.
Just to quote Isaac Newton, right? So
Right.
that's the thinking, you can say. And what we are adding to that is that this approach should be systematic. It should be transparent. It should be something that people could repeat and say, "Oh yeah, you're right. That's where we stand. That's what we know about it." So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so basically it's a good practice as old as time or as old as science itself. And you are saying and your group that the evidence base should be a systematic review of some sort,
Well,
right?
I would put it in another way,
Okay.
because we would rather say that you need to have a systematic approach, and you need to be transparent when you are trying to figure out what has been done. And if you can do that in other ways, you are still fulfilling the idea. So that's the foundation. When we look around and figure out that when we are talking about how could we summarize our making the state of the art within any area, within any scientific discipline, The only game in town I could find is the systematic review for now. I don't know what will happen with artificial intelligence, the combination of better digital tools and all of that. That could maybe change the approach. But today, the systematic review in any form, but typically the systematic review where you are making a search and you are including the studies based upon eligibility criteria and so forth, they are actually the only method I know that really could fulfill the criteria of being systematic and transparent. But I
Okay.
really need to say that we should
There
not.
may be other.
Yeah, yeah.
There may be others,
There
maybe
may
not
be
right
other.
now, but coming
Yeah,
down the pipe. Yes, we
yeah.
don't know how AI is going to change this whole. We see it contributing to this field, but it could completely change it soon,
Exactly. Yeah.
and we just don't know.
Yeah. No.
Um, okay, so in implementation science, we talk so much about, what are the barriers to this happening before we can actually address it.
Mm.
It makes so much sense, right? We shouldn't go research X until we know what we know about X, because otherwise we're just duplicating effort, we're wasting money. I mean, it's so logical what you're saying. So why isn't this happening?
Yeah, that's a good point. But before I answer that question, I think I need to add a little important thing here that might help me answering your question. This is when we talk about what do we know based upon the science that have been done. But I think I have difficulties finding an exception from this principle. Those who will use the results of the research you are trying to plan and do, and the reason why you are using an EBR approach, those people, that could be those who will use it. That's end users, of course, that makes sense. But it could also be those who are being affected by it. If you, for example, are making some research within climate, mitigation plans or mitigation initiatives to diminish or mitigate or adapt to climate changes, you maybe will come up with something that a lot of those being affected by it doesn't like. So you need to actually include their perspective, their understanding, or their experience, or their concerns when you have said, this sounds scientifically a smart idea, but let's hear what the end users are. So that's those two aspects, those two legs, so to speak, is really EBR in its full picture. We are saying figure out if there is a societal need, figure out if there is an evidence gap, combine those two. And if you have a situation where you clearly can see this is a brilliant question we have done, then you have a very strong foundation for moving on. You have better chance getting funded. You have better chance of getting people to join the project, either as test persons or as collaborators and so forth. So and then your question is really, and not only for implementation science, but for all kinds of scientific activities. I think my take on it is actually what you could call it a kind of an excuse. I'm really excusing myself. If you look at what I have been doing, if you look at my publications from the 90s and the zeros, well, I was not maybe that evidence-based as I should have been. I was not taught in that way. And I think the fact is very simple. Namely, it's true that Gilbert did so and so. He looked at all the books he could find. I don't think there was that many books about magnetism in the year of 1600. So maybe that was easy. But if you look at the number of studies being published even 40 years ago or 50 years ago, it was impossible. I clearly remember when I was the first time in the late 80s were coming to a scientific library, and I was asking, I would like to find some studies about this, and they gave me this huge book from the month of May or the month of June or the month of July from Index Medicus, and then I could browse, through and try to find how many studies were published by Anderson and how many studies have this particular topic in the title and stuff like that. It will take a lifetime. So we have the digitalization, we have the digital revolution, and that's only maybe 35 years old when it comes to what we're talking about. I remember I get my first email in 95. And going and searching, I clearly remember the librarians proudly showing me the CD-ROM. Now we can search on CD-ROMs and all of that. So I think that's an explanation for why it is so difficult. Because even when all that happened, I was a PhD student at that time. Uh, I was taught you should make your chain of arguments in your introduction that should justify your study. And then you should find wherever you have a statement or any strong statement, you should have a reference. So I keep running around asking my colleagues, do you know of a study where someone had said so and so? And then we just added this study. It was impossible to redo. It was impossible to, it was no transparency whatsoever. And it was definitely not systematically. And we made all the errors in citation bias wise you can imagine when we were doing that. But that's how we were taught, because that's how people have been doing it for several hundred years, because of the lack of the digital tools that we have nowadays. So
Right.
I think 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you could maybe say, no, this is difficult for me. Not today. There's no excuse today. But the problem is that when you really are moving on and making something new, sometimes you have to wait for a new generation to get the power that they will have been looking for when they were young.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm laughing because I remember when I have discussions now with my PhD students in terms of, getting access to a full text article and it's taking time. And I look at them, I'm like, I went to the dusty stacks and I had to pull it out. And literally 17 years ago, when we moved houses, I finally threw out boxes and boxes of
Yeah,
articles,
exactly.
not the
Exactly.
full text, meaning we needed these just to review the abstracts. We
Yeah,
collected all. So I'm laughing because yes,
yeah,
but on one hand,
exactly.
it's gotten easier, and on the other hand, it's also gotten much harder because the volume of publications every month now is not comparable to what it was when I was doing my PhD. So there's huge amounts, but hopefully AI can, and that's maybe in our next podcast, there'll be some huge AI revolution related to
Yeah, yeah. Well,
systematic reviews, and we could talk about
let's
that.
see, let's see, let's see. But
But
one point, Moria, is that uh, when this has been stated for years. There is a publication by Cynthia Munro from 94, who was stating that researchers should use this new thing called systematic review to inform their studies. And so we have been listening to that for years. But what we are trying to do as the network dealing with this topic of evidence-based research is trying to help people to figure out actually how to do that in practice. What to do if you have no systematic review, what to do if you have plenty of systematic review about the same topic, what to do if there's no original studies, and I mean all kinds of questions that people may have. So we are really working to figuring out how to use the digitalization in a proper way, so it still be transparent and systematic. Yeah.
right, amazing. So you had mentioned a few minutes ago how, well, if you look at the evidence in a systematic way, if you take an EBR approach and you speak to end users, then it's easier to get funding. Is that
Uh,
true? Do you think
we-
funders are really looking at if there's an EBR approach?
I think if you are, first of all, I can tell you that we have approached several funders. We have a good collaboration with something called EVIR, and now I can't remember what it stands for, but it is, yeah, I can't. But that's a group of concerned international group of funders
Hmm.
that are making some principles for doing a more fair and a more scientific grounded and a more end user or interest holders perspective included in their process. And we have had several meetings. We are constantly joining their meetings, and an EBR approach is important to them. Another thing is that in Norway, there is actually two funding agencies we are collaborating with right now. that were very interested in doing this. So we developed, one of my postdoc developed a very fancy program where he was looking at all these elements in a very structured way, and could tell the funders if it was worthwhile, with dollars as the
Oh,
indicator. Was it worthwhile to support this study compared to that study?
oh,
It could be done retrospectively, but also prospectively. So we have a clear understanding that if we just are explaining it clearly to the funding agency, they can see the benefit of having an application where people are, giving a trustworthy argumentation. I have had meetings with ethic committees about the same question, and what our talks always end, if we can convince the applicant to give a short explanation of how they know that this study is worthwhile, pointing to a systematic review or making maybe a systematic search and showing that, then the ethical committee fully understand and can follow that. But if they are going to evaluate this, and then they have too much on the plate, so to speak. And I think the funders, the real problem here is that who is actually the funders? That's the researchers. And the researchers,
or the
we have
citizens through their
always,
tax dollars,
yeah,
right?
yeah, they don't care about. We don't care about that, as to say. So you know what I mean. We know what I mean. We have our own agenda. For example, I met a journalist some years back who told me, when I told her about EBR, she told me, yes, I understand that because I learned a couple of years ago that I should have a standard question whenever a scientist approaching me and saying, could you make a piece in the newspaper about my study? The first question is, what else has been done in this area? Do you know what else has been done? What is the new thing you have contributing? And she told me no one was able to answer that question. That's the
Yeah.
10 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. And I think that's really the problem we have as a researcher. And I really count myself in because we are from the same environment. We are so eager to have our research lifted up that we forget. I'm listening every time I hear in the radio that people are referring to a study, and it is the researchers who are saying, "Now we know." You don't know anything with one study. You don't know anything. It's actually in 1750 something. There was a farmer, a researcher in farming, who was stating that if we just have one study, or we have several studies from many different countries, we don't know what is really the best way to grow this crop. You need to have a kind of a synthesis of all these in order to do that. So I mean, it's had been there
He
all the
understood
time,
it. Yeah.
and now we have the option. We have the digital revolution at our hand.
Right.
That's the paradox.
Yeah. Okay, so we're at time, but I always like to end with one bit of advice. So let's say a researcher, a PhD student, a postdoc comes to you and says, this is what I want to research. I can't find a systematic review that shows that there's a gap, and I don't have the funding or the time or the bandwidth to conduct a systematic review. What should that person do?
First, that's two step answer here. First of all, I will ask the person, do you like to do your entire PhD in vain? Do you like
In
to
what?
do
Oh,
in
in
vain?
vain.
Yeah. Do you like to do something that is not worthwhile, that's not contributing with anything?
All right.
And whenever I'm answering that question, which everyone is asking all the time, they fully understand my point. So maybe, and then I have the second part, but maybe you need to do the systematic review if no one else have done it. But I think, Moria, I think that we should acknowledge one important thing about PhD student. I can't come to think of a PhD student jumping from heaven like Mr. Bean and saying, "I will do this." It's always part of a larger research group where you have seniors who are saying, "I would like to I answer this question. Would you like to be the PhD student doing that?" Who should do the systematic review? The seniors. So it should not be the PhD student's responsibility to make sure of the foundation of the justification of the new Christian. That's really us, the seniors. That's mandatory for us before we are putting any PhD student out there on a shaky ground. We should make sure that we have examined that before they are even thinking about becoming a PhD student.
So, as a supervisor, I would push
Yeah.
back on that just because there's only so many systematic reviews, I can conduct or et cetera. And if I want to be able to accept, I have a PhD student very interested in midwifery and one very interested in nurse practitioners and I find it as my role to guide them through the systematic review process as opposed to the supervisor conducting the systematic review always.
First of all, it is surprisingly many systematic review out there. So if you are doing a proper search, you will most surely find something that could be used.
Right.
And if you're thinking we are trying
Maybe
to
not
do
of great quality, but there'll be
yeah.
something.
Yeah, there is
Right.
something, and you at least you can have an idea about what's out there, and maybe you need to update it, or maybe you need something else. But I think it is really not the PhD student who should do that. If it is, I mean, I can give you one example. There's a Danish. She just defended her thesis a year ago. She made the whole process as a PhD. There was a senior who was saying, we need to figure out what is the best rehabilitation program for survivors of cardiac arrest. So she did a systematic review of all earlier rehabilitation program that was evaluated. That's the first one. She did a very in detailed registration of all the concerns, all the experiences, all whatever of the survivors. There was a database in Denmark of all who had survived the cardiac arrest. And she got all kinds of information, both qualitative and quantitatively. So combining those two knowledge part,
Right.
she come up with a suggestion for a rehab program. And the third study was a feasibility study. So she did it as a PhD. So that's
Right.
another way to
Right.
do it.
Right. Yes, of course. That's what I mean. When my
Yeah.
student, that's
Yeah.
usually the
Yeah.
first chapter. Yes. Okay, Hans, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll talk again.
I hope so because I'm just starting.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you.